On October 15th, 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Vilas-Boas in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais was working one night in the fields. Only 23 years old, Antonio would soon spot a strange red star in the sky. The red star began flying toward him. As Antonio stared at the red light, he could see that the light was an egg-shaped craft. He would soon be taken, and what happened next would traumatize Antonio for years and would become a truly bizarre alien abduction story. In today's episode, we will examine the strange alien abduction of Antonio Vilas-Boas, the investigation of the event, as well as the implications. On October 15th, 1957, as Antonio was working in the field and the craft approached him, Antonio stared until he could make out the red light was actually an egg-shaped craft with a small dome on top. The UFO began slowly descending to the ground, and as it did, 3 legs descended. Antonio became frightened and attempted to flee. He hopped on his tractor, but after a short time, the engine died. He then hopped off the tractor and began running. However, he didn't get very far. Soon after running, a being around 5 feet tall would grab him and almost stop him. The entity was wearing a helmet, had gray overalls, and small blue eyes. As the one being wasn't strong enough to stop Antonio, soon 3 other beings would catch up, and the 4 would tackle Antonio. They grabbed him and dragged him into their mothership. Antonio said during this time the beings didn't speak but made some type of barking or screeching type of noise. Once Antonio was pulled into the craft, things would go from bad to worse. Antonio's clothes were forcibly removed, and he was covered with a strange gel over his body. From here, Antonio entered a large semicircular room that had strange red symbols on the walls. The entities would draw blood from his chin and then move him to a 3rd room. In here, a strange gas would fill the room, which made Antonio horribly ill. He would stay in this room for around half an hour, and then things would truly become bizarre. Antonio alleges after 30 minutes, a female alien entered the room. She was small, around 5 feet, like the other humanoids, and Antonio says she was extremely attractive. The being had large, blue, cat-like eyes with a pointed chin and long, platinum blonde hair. Being extremely attracted to the woman, Antonio and the entity engaged in sexual intercourse. Antonio noted the being never kissed him, but nipped on his chin. It's not evident from reports that Antonio was forced to do this, but it appears the being was there for one reason only. Even more so, according to Antonio, it appeared that the woman, or being, was relieved once they were done. After they finished, the female looked at Antonio with a satisfied smile and rubbed her belly, pointing up toward the sky. Antonio believes that the being was communicating that they would have a baby and she would raise it in space. After this, Antonio was given his clothes back and given a tour of the ship. As he knew no one would believe his story, he attempted to steal a device that looked like a clock. However, one of the beings took notice and stopped him from doing so. Antonio was then returned home and watched the craft fly up into the sky. After the event occurred, UFO investigator Olavo Fontes would examine the story. Fontes was a gastroenterologist who joined the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, in 1957. The APRO is an American UFO organization, and Fontes served as a representative for Brazil. Once Fontes joined, documented cases in Brazil would grow substantially. It should be said, though, it probably wasn't the case they weren't occurring. It was just that there weren't enough. On February 22, 1958, about 5 months after the event, Fontes met with Antonio about the experience. Antonio would recall to Fontes how several weeks after the incident, he experienced severe nausea, bad headaches, was lethargic, and had lesions on his skin. Initially, upon meeting with Antonio, Fontes wasn't convinced about his story. However, just 4 days later, Fontes alleges he was visited by officials from the U.S. government and Brazilian government. According to Fontes, he was warned to stop investigating UFO cases. Fontes claimed during this meeting both American and Brazilian officials told him 6 UFOs had crashed in the world since World War II. All the craft were small and all the occupants had died. The men adamantly stated the occupants were from another planet. Fontes believed the men were Navy officers and told him several other interesting things concerning the UFO phenomenon. 1. All the governments in the world were aware UFOs existed. 2. The crafts were powered by some type of electromagnetic field that produces some type of gravitational effect. 3. The beings are dangerous and that there was no defense against them. Fontes had several theories on the implications of what he was told. First, the aliens don't appear to have any interest in contacting us on a grand scale. In other words, they want to remain in the shadows. Second, they could be planning a mass-scale invasion, or maybe their goal was to stop humanity from expanding or exploring further in space. Many have pointed out the irony of officials confiding this top-secret information to Fontes as they were discouraging him from looking into UFOs. It should be said, though, Fontes was considered a very skilled writer. Many believe the government wanted this information leaked. It appears that it took years for Antonio's story to become popular and for many to learn of it. Even more strange, maybe, is a claim Antonio was invited by the U.S. government to examine a craft. Dr. Walter K. Buehler, a ufologist, claimed in 1962 the U.S. government contacted his organization and wanted Antonio to come to the United States and inspect a downed UFO. The letter was anonymous, and many believe this was done to push Antonio's story further in the spotlight. In time, Antonio would move on from the incident. He would become a lawyer, marry, have 4 kids, and finally pass away on January 17th, 1991. So what can we make of Antonio's case? Antonio's case was one of the first cases where the investigation revealed UFO crash retrievals and corpses by U.S. officials. In addition, it is considered credible by many as the abduction happened several years before the Betty and Barney Hill case. Many have pointed out too that Antonio wouldn't have been able to create a story like this. At the time of his abduction, Antonio was a poor, uneducated farmer. However, skeptics have pointed out that Antonio was much more intelligent than the average rural farmer. He went on to study and became a lawyer, which is surely not an easy feat. One other important thing to point out is Antonio was able to recall all these details without the use of hypnotic regression. This lends credence to the event as well. Cases where there is only one witness are understandably met with more skepticism than cases with multiple eyewitnesses. However, by all accounts, Antonio was an honest, hard-working man and never wavered on his story.